Sai Deepak, please.
Namaste, Jai Shri Ram. So the topic that has been given to us is India as a civilizational state shaping a global consciousness. In a single breath, this topic has clear esoteric loftiness and a certain degree of practicality, because you seem to be speaking of consciousness and the civilizational state in the same breath. In my view, while Bharat must aspire to shape global consciousness, in its current state of mind, I believe that it is at the heart of a churn, or perhaps what I call a metaphysical civil war, wherein it is not a battle of ideologies, it is not a battle of political sciences, it is not a battle of political affiliations, it is not a battle of linguistic affiliations or regional affiliations, it is a battle of metaphysics. At the heart of it, that is what I will bring it down to in terms of brass tacks. And the reason why I say that is, while I certainly believe that Bharat has the potential to shape a global consciousness and therefore a global order, a new global order, at this point we are perhaps not even anywhere close to the tipping point. We are inching towards it, because as we seek to decolonize and we seek to celebrate our past, the contentious aspects of our past, both immediate and ancient and medieval, will have to be set straight in terms of the record before you can project a consciousness for the rest of the world to adopt. At this point, what we are perhaps projecting is not consciousness but confusion, is my humble view. And this is not the function of any particular dispensation, but this is the function of where we are at history. Assuming for a moment that liberalization had taken place not in 1991 but perhaps 2 decades earlier, there's a decent chance that we would have been at this state in 1991. Because you would have managed to address questions of basics in terms of Maslow's needs, and from there you would have started asking questions of culture. So this question has started raising its head or rearing its head almost 70 years after independence, which I think is a tad bit too late for a civilization that wants to call itself the oldest and perhaps the wisest. That we'll see how wise it is as time goes by. In my view, there are 3 or 4 things that we may want to consider before we proceed to shape global consciousness, which is to ask ourselves, what is the consciousness of the Bharatiya civilization in the first place? And here perhaps there are a couple of principles and, let's say, building blocks that I'd want the audience to consider. Bharat is fundamentally a fusion of a pantheistic metaphysics and a henotheistic metaphysics, which means it sees God in all things, it sees Parabrahman in all things and the supreme consciousness in all things. And therefore, from there it comes down to the level of henotheism, wherein it believes in the universality of a particular supreme consciousness, but it believes in polytheism in action, which is to say that it is monotheistic in principle and polytheistic in fact, to put it in the words of Max Muller, because that's how he defined henotheism. Which means, while there may be one universal truth at the level of metaphysics and philosophy, at the Vyavaharik level, and by the time you come down to the level of practicalities and application, those manifestations become individual, they become different, and therefore diversity in expression is to be expected at that particular level. This civilization cannot be understood without its own arrangement or without its own understanding of metaphysics in the first place. Therefore, civilization is only downstream of metaphysics. So you start with metaphysics, from there you go to culture, from there you go to society, and from there you go to state, and from there you go to the Vishwa. That is the order. And just so that I get this right, this is to tie into what Mr. Tiwari or Dr. Tiwari actually suggested. Metaphysically, we believe in the concept of Rita. That is something called as universal good or bad, or universal morality. or the morality of the universe in that sense, if not universal morality. Second is, from metaphysics you come down to religion, which is a crude approximation for dharma, very crude approximation for dharma. So metaphysics to religion, rita to dharma. From religion you come down to society, therefore from dharma you come down to rashtra. From society you come down to state, and therefore from rashtra you come down to rajya. From state you come down to the world, and therefore from rajya you come down to the vishwa. This, I think, is the order, which is rita, dharma, rashtra, rajya, vishwa, metaphysics, religion, or yes, religion, culture, society, state, and the world. Today the battle is being constantly fought on social media platforms at the crudest, most superficial level possible, where you're fighting on political affiliation when there are serious underlying problems which are at the heart of the issue. In my view, the fight is between monotheism versus pantheism and henotheism on the other hand. Until that particular battle is resolved one way or another with some kind of reconciliation or extinction, whichever way you see it, depending on which way the wind blows, there is no way the rest of the issues can be addressed. So Bharat wants to be this big tent. I consciously avoid using the word big church because that is a usual word. I prefer to use the word big tent. Big tent of everything from matter to antimatter, in the hope that somehow it will find a way to reconcile both and harmonize both. That would have worked if at least there is some element of tolerance or acceptance within monotheistic traditions. But fundamentally, if it sets itself and pits itself against the other, and there is an element of rejection without which its identity is incomplete, then it's only a matter of time before it becomes a tussle, a struggle, and a war. So I don't see this as a battle that started from 700 AD. Perhaps it started with the advent of Tathagata Buddha. And ever since it's been going on. And while we want to trace, let's say, the advent of monotheism and the attendant behavior to one particular group or community or mindset, which we believe has come from outside, did we actually sow the seeds and lay the fertile ground for that very same thought through Bharat is a question that we don't wish to address. And therefore, unless we address that, we will never be able to answer the question of who aided Bhaktiar Khilji in the destruction of certain universities. Who invited him to do so to settle what scores? Those questions will never be addressed. So what I believe is, Bharat must certainly want to shape global consciousness, but right now it is, in my view, being a poor, cheap imitator of Western consciousness. And it hasn't come to the level of policy because it celebrates its own consciousness and its own civilizational origins and contributions at a symbolic and an ornamental level, but not at the level of practical policy application. So if your beliefs don't translate to any kind of policy application, it's like the Indian ethnic wear that you choose to wear at Diwali, but it has no application when you choose to go to your office spaces on a daily basis. It has no relevance whatsoever. It is an ornament. Therefore, if Bharat really wants to be at the big table of global powers, and if it believes that economics is going to do the trick on its own, sorry, I don't think that works. Because along with economics, what the world respects at that table is military heft, but which is preceded by and which is centered and rooted in some kind of vision which is original, unique, and your own. So culture, economics, and muscle go hand in hand. And Bharat seems to focus on economics and muscle, which it must in the interest of self-preservation, given the lessons of history it is yet to draw lessons from, or let's say the periods of history we are yet to draw lessons from. But it must start defining its cultural origins and its, let's say, its theistic origins better. It is constantly trying to beat around the bush on that subject by saying we are the land of this and we are the land of that, as opposed to actually having a debate on whose land is this and why. Because ultimately those are the issues that have turned campuses into battlegrounds. And if you do not have the guts or the gumption or the reed ki haddi to discuss those issues internally. आप वैश्विक तौर पे क्या डिस्कस करेंगे वो तो मुझे नहीं पता है, because they are not going to sit tight and wait for you to preach ज्ञान to them. So maybe, in my assessment, the next 10 or 15 years, we'll see two things. Bharat's economic rise and its confidence being a thorn in the flesh of quite a few powers, both in the East and the West, and who you think as friends may not turn out to be friends ultimately. And you will realize that until you have the ability to go on your own, you won't have the ability to reshape the world or the global order. And simultaneously, there will be a raging battle in all parts of Bharat, played out at the metaphysical level and the physical level. Now, this won't be a linear equation, because history never works in linearity. It is never in seriatim. This will be non-linear. So while you address external challenges, you will have to constantly address the raging fire within. And in my view, external threats are easier to handle because there is some way of pinning the tag of the other on the external person, and usually translates to territorial aggression and economic aggression. The internal battle is the deeper battle, because the introduction of a Trojan virus inside the heart of Bharat's consciousness is what has been playing itself out, according to me, for the last 2000 years, not 1400 years or 700 years. So until that Trojan is addressed, which happens to be the root of all intolerant traditions, we will continue to water that particular Trojan in the belief that it will coexist. Some of the most vociferous movements in this country and divisive movements in this country are not funded by our friends on either sides of the Atlantic. They are funded by entities which are to the east of Russia. And that is something that we may not want to address. And east of Russia is not necessarily America. There is another country in between, which we think is our friend. Because we define friendships on geopolitical basis, on territorial basis, on military basis, on economic basis. But we still don't have the clarity to define who is a friend and who is an enemy from a cultural perspective. So someone can be a friend geopolitically, but ultimately could be your metaphysical adversary. And that clarity is important. Grateful. Thank you.